Geronimo was not among those.
For the 10 years after his celebrated victory, Geronimo fought one bloody battle after another with Mexicans. In all that time, he was completely unknown to Americans. His first encounter with them was friendly. A handful of land surveyors came through Apache country, and Geronimo traded ponies, skins, and blankets with them for clothing and food. They were good men, he remembered, and we were sorry they had gone on into the West. They were the first white men I ever saw.
He may wonder, this is a whole different species of person from the Mexicans who have raided and killed and enslaved us for maybe a century. Maybe we have something to hope from these white eyes.
The Apaches didn't know it at the time, but the men who traded with Geronimo had been sent to mark a new international boundary. At the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, the United States had wrested huge swaths of territory from Mexico, including large areas of Apache land. The surveyors were followed in the 1850s by thousands of other Americans, as fortune hunters streamed through Chiricahua country on the way to California gold. The Apaches debated how to respond to the newcomers. They looked to the one leader who could speak for all of the Chiricahua bands, Geronimo's father-in-law, Cochise.
Cochise was probably the greatest warrior and chief that the Chiricahuas had ever had. I think even to this very day that name is spoken with great reverence.
Cochise is one of those people who earns a reputation not only as a warrior but as a statesman, if you like, as a diplomat.
The Americans, Cochise believed, were an irritant, not a threat. He negotiated a deal allowing travelers, goods, and mail to pass through his people's land. But when Spanish gold mines were rediscovered in the Southwest, American prospectors came to stay.
The miners that descend on Arizona are mostly a lawless bunch of people.
Mining camps are full of young men who are almost completely beyond any social bounds. They are one of the worst places in the American West. They are absolutely full of racism. Miners are disastrous for most Native American people.
Some miners were barbarous, poisoning the Apaches' food with strychnine, cutting fetuses out of the bellies of pregnant women, selling Apache girls into slavery. When Americans decapitated a venerated Apache chief and sent his boiled skull back east as a gruesome trophy, they pushed Cochise too far.
He believed in punishing someone that was wrong and in punishing people that were responsible for, his people dying or getting hurt. He wasn't going to let anybody take advantage of him or his people.
Cochise urged Geronimo and the Chiricahuas to take revenge. All of the Indians agreed not to be friendly with the white man anymore, Geronimo later said. Sometimes we attacked the white men, sometimes they attacked us. The Chiricahuas ambushed stagecoaches and wagon trains, mutilating their victims, smashing heads with rocks, stabbing corpses with their spears, dangling bodies over fires.
What happened back then happened because they were humans. It was done to them. So they did it back. But better.
In his 40s now, Geronimo's face showed the ravages of war.
The scars from bullets across his cheek, One journalist spoke of how one of those injuries had caused him to seem to have a perpetual sneer, a sneer of hatred, a sneer of contempt.
The man had a very impressive face, extremely handsome in his way. In Apache, one would say hashke. There is a measure of meanness and anger in the face.
Through the 1860s, as the war with the Apaches raged, the growing population of white settlers became increasingly angry that the government was not protecting them. In the frontier town of Tucson, to the east of Chiricahua Territory, newspapers called for retribution. While utter extermination might not be considered practical, one columnist wrote, sound whippings of Apaches should be encouraged. We must stand by our race, for blood is thicker than water, declared another. Let slip the dogs of war in good earnest upon all Indians. News of the escalating violence shook Washington. To bring order to the Southwest, President Ulysses S. Grant sent his most respected Indian fighter to Arizona. A veteran of the Civil War, General George Crook had been fighting Indians ever since. Though he would prove ruthless in his pursuit of Apaches, Crook had an unusual empathy for Indians.
General Crook, from the perspective of our own tribe, was one of the generals who tried hardest to understand things from an Apache's perspective. And it was something that our people at that time greatly appreciated, that there was somebody who would actually talk with them.
Crook was forever talking about how intelligent Apaches were. He was a firm believer that with proper forms of formal education, Apache people could quickly become civilized, quote unquote, and become upstanding members of society.
Crook was charged with implementing a new federal Indian policy. Instead of treating native tribes as sovereign nations, as the U.S. had been doing for more than a century, Indians would now be wards of the state. Over the next decade, the American Army would force tribe after tribe onto reservations.
The reservation becomes this dominant way of containing Indian people. This place where Indian people can be contained and then worked on, right? Transformed and changed so that they can have a future within American society.
Crook's strategy was as simple as it was difficult to enforce. His basic idea was that if Apache people would stay on their reservations, he would do everything he could to make their lives comfortable. But those who refused and who continued raiding, he vowed to hunt down to the very last man.
10 years earlier, the Apaches' neighbors, the Navajos, had faced a similar choice: comply with the American demands or fight. The Navajos chose war. After a brutal military campaign, the American Army forced them into submission. Survivors were marched off their ancestral land to a distant reservation. Along the way, hundreds died of starvation and disease. Apaches knew this history well.
The Navajo people and Apache people knew one another. They shared information. There was a whole network of information exchange between the tribes in the area.
Many Apaches reluctantly agreed to settle on reservations. Crook played Apaches against each other. He offered them incentives to become scouts for the U.S. Army and lead the hunt for Apaches who refused to give in.
Ewiyo and Dodd It's a lot of quick kind of no will teen of John and Ton with Lindy. Ewa, the pin are you scouts as little. Scouts really will take on a tea. Scouts is near you, he take on a tea. It will be so. And that baby so he cannot see. Can't be done ID. Husa how much there is lancing. Hayusha dance near lancing.
For several years, as one by one Apache chiefs agreed to reservation life, Cochise and the Chiricahuas continued to fight. But the time came when the great Chiricahua leader realized his people could not resist forever.
Cochise recognized that the Anglo-Americans were a more formidable foe than the Mexicans. They had better technology. Their army was far more efficient. And he sensed that there was too many of them. There were so many people compared to his people.
After a decade of war, Cochise agreed to halt the killing and to end Apache raids north of the Mexican border. In return, the Americans would create a reservation for the Chiricahua on their ancestral homeland, a pristine wilderness of mountains, canyons, streams, and open fields, prime land in the eyes of the settlers.
The United States told them, well, all you have to do is just stay in this one spot. That was the arrangement they had made in order to stay in their own land.
With minimal interference from the U.S., the Chiricahua lived much as they had for generations, raiding into Mexico whenever they needed horses and supplies. But just 2 years later, Cochise died, and the deal he had struck with the Americans was put at risk.
Cochise's death was an irreplaceable loss. No one would ever take his place. No one would ever unite the various bands of Chiricahua the way Cochise succeeded in doing.
The death of Cochise brought out what the Americans thought was an opportunity to open up that area of land for mining and settlement, and that without leaders such as Cochise, they would be much easier to eventually conquer.
With Cochise gone, the federal government decided to move the Chiricahua 150 miles north to a mosquito-ridden reservation called San Carlos. This would open the valuable Chiricahua land for American settlement and appease the Mexicans who were fed up with Apache raiding. A young reservation agent named John Clum was sent from San Carlos to deliver the news. Reluctantly, the Chiricahuas agreed to move. Clum's final meeting was with Geronimo's brother-in-law, Chief Ho. Ho stuttered, so Geronimo spoke for him. "We will move to San Carlos," Geronimo told Clum.